1943. A Nazi steps off a train. In Texas. He's not alone. Thousands of his comrades follow, blinking in the blinding, alien sunlight of the American South. These are the defeated, the ragged remnants of the Afrika Korps. Men who had served under the Desert Fox, Rommel, and who, until just weeks before, believed implicitly in the Third Reich's inevitable victory. They had surrendered in Tunis, and now, by the tens of thousands, they were being shipped across the Atlantic, deposited deep in the heart of the United States. The sheer scale of the operation was staggering. America was suddenly hosting over 370,000 enemy prisoners of war. In Texas alone, dozens of major camps sprang up. Camp Swift, Camp Bowie, Mexia, Hereford, and the focus of our story today, the crucible of ideological warfare, Camp Hearne. This was no typical POW camp. Hearne, situated near Bryan, Texas, became the spiritual and sometimes literal battlefield for the soul of the German military. The men arriving here were not just soldiers, they were the diehards, the fanatical, the unrepentant, the officers and NCOs who carried the swastika banner in their hearts. Among them was a cohort of senior officers, men who had been at the sharp end of Rommel's campaigns, men who, even in defeat, still held absolute command over their subordinates, enforcing the iron will of the Führer hundreds of miles from the front. We are talking about the man who was, by reputation and deed, Rommel's fiercest officer. But the United States Army was about to subject these officers to a psychological experiment, an unprecedented program of re-education and ideological segregation designed to break that very loyalty. The story of how Texas broke the Nazi officer corps is one of surveillance, murder, and the quiet, devastating power of uncensored truth. The first shock for the Germans was not brutality, but the stunning adherence to the Geneva Convention. They expected concentration camps, starvation, and vengeance. Instead, they received 3 square meals a day, often better and more plentiful than the rations issued to their own guards. They were paid 80 cents a day for voluntary labor, picking cotton, harvesting peanuts, or working in the massive agricultural operations that defined the Texas economy. They were housed in wooden barracks, often with screened windows and running water. This prosperity, this sheer abundance, was the first subtle crack in the Nazi worldview. For years, the officers had been fed Goebbels' propaganda. America was a decadent, weak, racially degenerate nation on the brink of collapse. Yet, here they were, surrounded by it, living a life of relative ease. But the ideological war was already being waged within the wire. Camp Hearne quickly became the epicenter of fanaticism. The senior officers, particularly the Oberstleutnants and Majors of the Afrika Korps, maintained a rigid command structure. They viewed themselves not as prisoners, but as a detached fighting unit waiting for the inevitable victory. The camp commandant, Colonel John L. Kennedy, a man who understood the psychological terrain, was faced with a severe problem. The officers were using the camp as a proving ground for their loyalty. Any man who showed the slightest deviation from the party line, any man who questioned Hitler, or even worse, expressed gratitude for American treatment, was marked. They called these deviants progressives, or, with utter contempt, white rats. The man who enforced this loyalty, the archetype of Rommel's fiercest officer, ran a shadow government. This internal Wehrmacht structure held its own secret courts, issued death sentences, and carried them out with chilling efficiency. The most notorious example of this ideological terror took place not exactly at Hearne, but at Camp Mexia, another Texas facility, and it perfectly illustrates the deadly stakes. In March 1944, 3 prisoners, Johannes Kunze, Willi Flossbach, and Walter Beyer, were found guilty by a secret Nazi court of disloyalty, primarily for accepting work assignments and cooperating with the Americans. They were brutally murdered by their comrades, hanged in the barracks. The murder sent a shockwave. The message was simple: your body may be in Texas, but your soul belongs to the Führer. The American response was slow, but once the machinery of intelligence was brought to bear, it was devastatingly effective. The U.S. Army had a secret weapon, run by the Military Intelligence Service's Special Projects Division. This was the M44 program, and its goal was not merely to house the enemy, but to de-Nazify them. The key to the entire operation was surveillance. At Hearne and other high-value officer camps, the Americans bugged the barracks. They installed hidden microphones, often disguised as heating vents or light fixtures, in the latrines, the mess halls, and the sleeping quarters. They listened, transcribed, and analyzed every single conversation. Declassified documents from this program reveal a chilling level of detail. The intelligence officers knew who was plotting murder, who was a committed Nazi, and who was quietly breaking down. They categorized every prisoner into 3 groups. 1. Black. The diehards, fanatical, committed Nazis. 2. Gray. The opportunists, apolitical soldiers who would follow the strongest leader. 3. White. The anti-Nazis, or progressives, those willing to cooperate and reject the ideology. The man we are focused on, Rommel's fiercest officer, was a definitive black. He was heard on the wire, issuing orders, organizing resistance, and ensuring the absolute adherence to the Heil Hitler salute. His unwavering faith was the pillar of the camp's fanaticism. But the Americans were not just listening. They were initiating a sophisticated program of psychological warfare, designed to isolate and shatter this fanatic core. The strategy was twofold: segregation and illumination. First, they began to quietly segregate the population. The known white rats were moved to separate, safer camps, like Camp Bowie, where they were given preferential treatment, better food, and access to American media. This created an immediate, visible split in the command structure. Second, the illumination began. The Americans started showing the prisoners the uncensored reality of the war. They provided German-language newspapers and magazines that were not controlled by Goebbels. They showed them Life magazine and Time. Imagine the scene. The officer, who for years had been told that Germany was fighting a defensive war against Bolshevik hordes and Anglo-American decadence, is shown photographs of American factories churning out aircraft by the thousands. He sees the massive, well-fed American public, driving cars, living a life of unimaginable luxury. He is forced to read reports sourced from the BBC and Swiss newspapers, detailing the collapse of the Eastern Front, the devastating bombing of Hamburg and Berlin, and the strategic reality of the Allies' unstoppable advance. The internal conflict was immense. To admit the truth was to admit that every sacrifice, every death of a comrade, and every order he had given was based on a monstrous lie. The tipping point often came with the revelation of the Holocaust. The Americans provided evidence, including photographs and survivor testimonies, to the officers. The diehards attempted to dismiss it as Allied propaganda, but the sheer volume and detail began to erode the conviction of the grey, and eventually even some of the black officers. For our archetype, Rommel's fiercest officer, the psychological break was a slow, agonizing process. The historian Arnold Kramer documented how the officers were tormented by the reality of the war's end. Their entire identity was wrapped up in the Wehrmacht and the Nazi cause. To reject it was to become nothing. But the evidence, compiled by the secret listeners, was overwhelming. In late 1944 and early 1945, the intelligence transcripts reveal a shift. The tone of the senior officers changed from arrogant certainty to desperate denial, and finally to quiet despair. The realization that the war was lost, not because of a temporary setback, but because the foundational premise of the Nazi state, that it was technologically and morally superior, was false, shattered their loyalty. This psychological victory allowed the Americans to implement the final stage of the M44 program, the creation of the white camps, the re-education centers. The Americans identified the officers who had finally cracked, those who saw the truth and were willing to admit it. They were offered a choice: remain with the fanatics or enter the white program. The white officers, now considered rehabilitated, were moved to camps like Camp Alva, Oklahoma, or special segregated facilities in Texas. Here, they were not just shown propaganda, they were given college-level courses in democracy, history, and civics. They read the U.S. Constitution and the writings of Thomas Jefferson. They were being prepared to return to Germany not as defeated soldiers, but as the seeds of a future democratic nation. The betrayal of the diehards was complete. The most committed fanatics, the pure blacks, were rounded up and shipped to maximum security camps like Camp Alva, where they were totally isolated from the white and grey populations. The historical documents confirm that many of the senior officers who had been the most ardent enforcers of the Nazi line, the equivalent of Rommel's fiercest officer, eventually cooperated. Not out of love for America, but out of a desperate, pragmatic realization that they had been fighting for a criminal regime and a lost cause. They provided the Americans with lists of the most dangerous diehards. They testified to the kangaroo courts and the murders. Until Texas broke his loyalty to Hitler, the officer was a weapon. After the psychological bombardment of American prosperity, uncensored news, and the undeniable truth of the Reich's collapse, he became a witness, a key asset in the dismantling of the Nazi ideology. The results of the Texas experiment were profound. By the end of the war, thousands of German POWs had gone through some form of the M44 re-education program. When they finally returned to a devastated post-war Germany, they carried with them not just memories of defeat, but the seeds of American democratic ideals. They had seen the enemy, and the enemy was not the decadent weakling described by Goebbels, but a powerful, prosperous, and ideologically free nation. These former POWs, many of whom had served under Rommel in the Afrika Korps, became known as the Rückkehrer, the returnees. They were often viewed with suspicion by those who had stayed in Germany, but their first-hand experience of American life was invaluable in the rebuilding of a democratic West Germany. It is a stunning, often overlooked chapter of the Second World War, that the battle for the soul of the German army was not fought on the beaches of Normandy or the frozen steppes of Russia, but in the heat and dust of the Texas plains, with microphones and magazines as the primary weapons. The war ended, but the psychological scars remained. The men who had enforced the will of the Führer in the brutal Texas heat had to live with the knowledge that their entire worldview had been a lie, shattered by the simple, undeniable truth of American reality. Which POW story should we cover next? A. The Sheriff. B. The Christmas Truce. Comment.